In the summer of 1914, Britain stood as the undisputed banker of the planet, the anchor of a financial network that reached from Hong Kong to Buenos Aires, from Cairo to Kolkata, with the pound sterling functioning as the world's reserve currency and the City of London serving as the clearinghouse where empires borrowed. Trade was settled, and the price of the future was quietly written down in gold. Britain did not merely govern a set of colonies, it governed a system of credit, and as history would soon demonstrate, credit is only ever as strong as the next payment that comes due. Within 3 short years, that vast financial empire teetered on the edge of collapse. Britain's national debt had rocketed from roughly £650 million to more than £7 billion. Its running credit line with the American banking house of J.P. Morgan had swollen to nearly $400 million, and the Treasury in London was burning through cash at a pace that would have seemed like fiscal madness only a few years before, pouring more than a quarter of the entire national income into the war machine every single year. Across the Atlantic, President Woodrow Wilson held enormous leverage over that machine, because American capital had become the lifeblood keeping the Allied war effort upright, and Wilson was not shy about reminding London of that fact. Britain was running low on gold, low on options, and low on time, and so the government of the world's most powerful empire did something almost nobody expected. Rather than turning to a general or a fellow monarch, it turned to a banker, and on the 2nd of November 1917, it issued a carefully worded 67-word letter that would come to be known as the Balfour Declaration, a document whose consequences are still shaping the modern world more than a century later. Most people encounter this story in a simplified form, a short letter from a British foreign secretary expressing sympathy for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, framed as an act of goodwill in the middle of a terrible war. But that popular version tends to leave out the financial emergency that helped drive it, the banking relationships that smoothed the way, the competing and contradictory promises Britain was making behind closed doors at the very same time, and the hard-nosed imperial reasoning that turned a distant province of the collapsing Ottoman Empire into one of the most contested pieces of land on Earth. To understand why a struggling wartime government was willing to make sweeping promises about territory it did not control, it helps to first appreciate just how severe Britain's financial crisis had become. When war broke out in August of 1914, Britain's national debt sat at a comfortable 27% of its economic output, the product of decades of Victorian and Edwardian fiscal caution. London was the unrivaled center of global finance, and Britain's overseas investments alone were worth roughly a tenth of the entire national economy, making it, by any measure, the wealthiest country in the world. Nobody anticipated what followed. The conflict that many assumed would be resolved by Christmas of 1914 instead became the most expensive military undertaking in human history to that point, and the traditional tools of wartime finance, higher taxes, government bonds, and patriotic appeals to the public, proved wildly insufficient against the demands of industrialized warfare. By 1915, the initial war budgets were already exhausted. By 1916, the Treasury was borrowing at levels that would have looked reckless only 2 years earlier. And by 1917, defense spending alone consumed more than half of the country's entire economic output. Britain was spending faster than it could tax or borrow, and crucially, it was not simply financing its own war, it was underwriting the entire Allied coalition. France's finances were in dire shape. Russia's economy was disintegrating alongside its army and government. Italy needed constant support, and smaller Allied nations such as Serbia, Belgium, and Romania were surviving largely on British credit. Britain had effectively become the financial guarantor for the whole anti-German coalition, channeling enormous sums to its partners while also feeding its own war effort. And across the years from 1914 to 1919, the country's cumulative budget shortfall reached roughly 1.5 times its entire annual economic output. Taxation covered only about a quarter of total wartime spending, a higher share than most of Britain's European counterparts managed, yet still nowhere near enough, and the difference had to come from borrowing, most of it from the United States, which is where the House of Morgan enters the story in earnest. From early in the conflict, J.P. Morgan and Company positioned itself as Britain's chief financial representative in America, a relationship that proved lucrative for both sides. Morgan arranged the purchase of well over $3 billion in war supplies for the Allies, everything from artillery shells to wheat to industrial chemicals, and led the underwriting syndicate behind a $500 million Anglo-French loan in October of 1915, the largest foreign bond offering Wall Street had ever seen, backed by a roster of major American industrial and financial figures. At first, Britain paid for American goods by selling off overseas assets and physically shipping gold across the Atlantic. But as German submarine warfare made those shipments increasingly dangerous, payments shifted toward credit. And by early 1917, Morgan alone was carrying roughly $500 million of unsecured British short-term debt. A commitment so deep that one prominent historian later observed, it was almost as much a rescue of Morgan as it was of Britain when America ultimately entered the war. If Britain fell, the bank's fortunes would fall with it, and if the bank collapsed, the shockwaves would ripple through Wall Street and into an American economy that had grown increasingly entangled with the war through industrial contracts and financial commitments. This produced an unusual alignment of interests. Britain needed American money to keep functioning. American financiers needed Britain to survive so their loans could be repaid, and President Wilson understood that this dependency gave him enormous leverage he was fully prepared to use. In late November of 1916, Wilson directed the Federal Reserve to discourage American banks from extending further foreign loans or purchasing more foreign securities, a pointed warning shot that landed just before Morgan had planned to arrange an even larger Anglo-French bond to help fund a major military push planned for 1917. The move pushed the entire system of private transatlantic war financing to the brink. Morgan's overdraft with Britain hit its peak of roughly $400 million that spring. France had essentially run out of financial road. And although Britain might have limped along a while longer on its own, it could not keep bankrolling the rest of the coalition indefinitely. Wilson's strategy was calculated. He wanted the war to conclude on American terms, with the United States emerging as the dominant financial power in any post-war arrangement, rather than as a junior partner underwriting British ambitions. By the final days of June and again, in late July of 1917, Britain came within hours of formally defaulting on its obligations, a near miss serious enough to convince Washington that a British financial collapse would be disastrous for everyone involved. And when the United States formally entered the war in April of 1917, private Wall Street financing of the Allies gave way to direct funding from the American government, quietly marking the end of Britain's era as the world's dominant financial power, even though the full transfer of that status would take decades to complete. It is against this backdrop of desperation and deal-making that the Zionist movement enters the story. And the timing here is genuinely significant, because the declaration that would later bear Arthur Balfour's name emerged not purely from humanitarian sentiment, but from a mixture of strategic calculation layered on top of decades of prior groundwork. Long before 1917, one man in particular had already shaped the foundations of Jewish settlement in Palestine. Baron Edmund James de Rothschild of the French branch of the famous banking family, who beginning in the early 1880s, in the aftermath of violent anti-Jewish pogroms across the Russian Empire, invested enormous personal wealth into purchasing land and establishing agricultural settlements in Ottoman-controlled Palestine, funding communities such as Rishon LeZion and Zikron Yaakov, covering their debts, supplying equipment, building infrastructure, introducing new crops, and establishing wineries that still operate today. Over his lifetime, he donated the equivalent of millions of pounds and helped acquire roughly 125,000 acres of land, becoming known locally simply as the Baron. Edmund was not a political Zionist in the mold of Theodor Herzl, and was initially skeptical of the idea of a formal Jewish state, but he believed strongly in Jewish agricultural self-sufficiency in the historic homeland, and committed vast resources toward that goal, meaning that by the time the First World War began, an established, privately funded network of Jewish settlements already existed on the ground in Palestine, built up over 3 decades. This context matters because when the British government began seriously discussing what would become the Balfour Declaration in 1917, it was not inventing a concept out of thin air. It was offering official imperial backing to an existing and generously funded project. Formal discussions between British officials and Zionist leaders began at a meeting on the 7th of February 1917, just weeks after Wilson's financial pressure campaign had pushed Britain toward the edge. And among the attendees was Sir Mark Sykes, the same diplomat who had secretly helped carve up Ottoman territory with France the previous year. In the months that followed, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour asked Lord Rothschild and Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann to draft a public statement of support for a Jewish homeland themselves. A striking detail worth pausing on, since it meant the British government invited the very people who stood to benefit from the promise to write its wording. And it addressed that invitation to a member of one of the most financially influential families in the world, whose name carried significant weight not only in London, but in the financial centers of New York as well. The initial draft proposed that Palestine be recognized as the national home of the Jewish people. The British cabinet softened the language somewhat, but the underlying intent remained largely intact. And according to the Rothschild family's own archival records, British officials had hoped as early as 1916 that supporting Zionist aspirations might help secure financial backing from Jewish communities and financiers for the war effort, a consideration that was discussed openly within government circles rather than hidden as some hidden conspiracy. Of course, the financial angle was only one part of a much larger strategic calculation. By the autumn of 1917, the broader war had settled into a grinding stalemate, and 2 of Britain's key partners were, for the moment, of limited practical use. The United States had declared war in April, but had not yet suffered significant casualties or deployed meaningful numbers of troops, while Russia was consumed by revolution, with Bolshevik leaders openly calling for an immediate end to the fighting and threatening to withdraw from the conflict entirely, which would have freed German forces to redirect their full strength toward the Western Front before American reinforcements could arrive in force. Britain needed to shore up support on every available front, financial, political, and psychological, and officials believed that a public gesture toward Zionism could help on several of these fronts simultaneously, by encouraging sympathetic Jewish communities in the United States to press for stronger American commitment, by helping to keep Jewish soldiers in Russia motivated to keep fighting at a moment when Bolshevik leaders were offering peace, and by cultivating a friendly population in Palestine near the Suez Canal, a waterway of enormous strategic importance as the primary link between Britain and its territories in India, Australia, and the wider Far East. Opened in 1869, the canal had transformed the journey from London to India from a matter of weeks into a matter of days, and safeguarding its eastern approach through Palestine was considered a serious strategic priority rather than an afterthought. There was also a less obvious but genuinely important scientific dimension to this story, tied closely to the chemist and future first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, who was working at the University of Manchester when, in 1915, he developed a fermentation process capable of producing acetone from starch using a bacterium he had previously isolated. This breakthrough mattered enormously because acetone was an essential ingredient in the production of cordite, the smokeless propellant used in nearly every British shell and bullet fired during the war, and before Weizmann's discovery. Acetone had largely been produced using materials imported from Germany, an option that had obviously disappeared, or through an extremely inefficient process of distilling it from wood. When Winston Churchill, then serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, learned of Weizmann's process, he reportedly summoned the chemist and asked directly whether Britain would need roughly 30,000 tons of acetone and whether Weizmann could deliver it. Weizmann could, and did, resigning his academic position to help scale the process industrially. And by 1917, British factories were producing tens of thousands of gallons of acetone annually to meet the enormous wartime demand for cordite, contributing to the production of hundreds of millions of shells fired by British forces over the course of the war, all without Wiseman seeking payment for the rights to his process. What makes this convergence so notable is that Wiseman was simultaneously helping solve one of Britain's most pressing wartime industrial problems, while also serving as one of the most persistent and well-connected Zionist advocates, with direct access to senior British officials, having cultivated relationships with figures including David Lloyd George, Arthur Balfour, and Winston Churchill. And when Lloyd George was later asked what reward Britain had offered Wiseman for his scientific contribution, he pointed to the Balfour Declaration itself, a connection widely discussed and believed at the time, even if historians continue to debate exactly how decisive it was. There is also a well-known exchange between Wiseman and Balfour that captures something of the emotional weight behind these negotiations. When Wiseman was pressed on why Zionists were focused specifically on Palestine rather than some alternative territory, Balfour reportedly noted that Britain itself had London, as if to suggest a practical people should be content with any suitable homeland, to which Wiseman is said to have replied that this was true, but that the Jewish people had Jerusalem when London was still a marsh. Yet the Balfour Declaration did not emerge in isolation. It was in fact the third in a series of overlapping and contradictory wartime promises Britain made concerning the very same territory. And understanding those contradictions is essential to understanding much of what followed in the region afterward. The first of these commitments came through the McMahon-Hussine correspondence, a series of letters exchanged between 1915 and 1916 between Sir Henry McMahon, Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt, and Sharif Hussein bin Ali of Mecca, in which Britain offered support for Arab independence in return for an Arab uprising against Ottoman rule. The precise boundaries of the promised Arab territory were left deliberately vague, particularly regarding Palestine, and that ambiguity appears to have been intentional, allowing Britain room to maneuver once the war concluded. Sharif Hussein nonetheless believed Palestine fell within the promised territory, and on that understanding he launched the Arab Revolt, sending his sons Faisal and Abdullah into a grueling desert campaign against Ottoman forces alongside British officer T.E. Lawrence, with thousands of Arab fighters losing their lives in the belief that victory would bring genuine independence, and notably, an internal 1919 memo from Britain's own Foreign Office to its delegation at the Paris Peace Conference acknowledged that the government was indeed committed by McMahon's letters to include Palestine within the promised boundaries of Arab independence. The second commitment arrived through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, negotiated secretly in May of 1916 between Britain's Sir Mark Sykes and France's François-Georges-Picot, with Russian approval, dividing former Ottoman territories into British and French zones of influence. Under this arrangement, Palestine was slated for some form of international administration, deliberately left undefined, and the agreement directly conflicted with the promises made to Hussein, which is precisely why it was kept secret at the time. Then, in November of 1917, came the Balfour Declaration, promising a national home in the very same territory to the Zionist movement, meaning that within roughly 2 years, Britain had made 3 separate and largely incompatible commitments regarding one piece of land, promising independence to Arab leaders, a sphere of influence to France, and a national home to Zionist leaders. While the Arab population that actually made up the overwhelming majority of Palestine's residents at the time was not named directly in any of these agreements, referred to in the Balfour Declaration only in passing as the existing non-Jewish communities. These were not simple oversights by overwhelmed wartime bureaucrats, but calculated decisions, as Britain sought to maintain multiple relationships simultaneously in the service of winning the war and preserving its imperial position, and each party ultimately received something different. Arab leaders received a revolt and its costs, France received a sphere of influence, Zionist leaders received a declaration, and Palestine itself was left to grapple with the consequences for generations afterward. Returning to the financial thread, The aftermath of the war illustrates just how deeply economic pressure had shaped British decision-making throughout this period. Because when the fighting ended in November of 1918, Britain's financial position was almost unrecognizable compared to 1914. National debt exceeded £7 billion. Much of the country's once-envied overseas investment portfolio had been sold off to fund the war. Loans extended to Russia were rendered essentially worthless after the Bolshevik government repudiated its predecessor's debts, and the United States expected full repayment of everything it had lent during the war's final phase, obligations Britain would struggle with for decades. The country that had entered the war as the world's leading creditor emerged from it as one of the world's leading debtors, and the center of global financial power shifted decisively from London toward New York, with the pound sterling settling into a role clearly secondary to the American dollar. Managing the new territories Britain had acquired through its wartime bargaining, including Mesopotamia, Transjordan, and Palestine, added further strain to an already exhausted treasury. The Mandate for Palestine, granted to Britain by the League of Nations in 1920, became the mechanism through which the promises of the Balfour Declaration were meant to be implemented, tasking Britain with facilitating Jewish immigration and supporting the development of a Jewish national home, while simultaneously being expected to protect the rights of the existing population. An inherently difficult balancing act administered by a government under severe financial strain. Over the following decades, the tensions built into this arrangement escalated significantly. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased steadily through the 1920s, accelerated after the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and increased dramatically following the Holocaust, while the Arab population, watching its demographic and economic position shift, responded with growing protest and unrest, culminating in the widespread uprising known as the Great Arab Revolt between 1936 and 1939, which required a substantial British military response to contain. By the close of the Second World War, Britain's financial situation had deteriorated even further, with national debt reaching historic highs relative to the size of its economy, its global empire contracting rapidly, and Palestine increasingly difficult to govern amid rising violence from multiple sides, including attacks on British personnel and infrastructure. In 1947, facing mounting costs and an increasingly unmanageable situation, Britain referred the question of Palestine's future to the newly established United Nations and withdrew, a decision widely understood less as a graceful handover than as an acknowledgement that the mandate had become unsustainable. And the following year, in May of 1948, the State of Israel declared independence, with Chaim Weizmann, the chemist whose wartime contribution had helped shape Britain's calculations decades earlier, becoming its first president. It is worth being careful and precise here, because this is a subject prone to oversimplification in both directions. Some accounts reduce the entire episode to a single transactional claim, suggesting Britain effectively sold Palestine to secure Jewish financial backing, a framing that is too tidy and does not reflect the messy, layered reality of what actually occurred. Since the Balfour Declaration was not a financial receipt, no direct payment changed hands in exchange for the letter, and the Rothschild family itself was far from unified on the question of Zionism, with some family members actively opposed to the movement. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to suggest financial considerations played no role at all, since the historical record, including the Rothschild family's own archives, clearly shows that British officials discussed the potential benefits of Jewish financial and political support, and the timing of the declaration, arriving at the precise moment of Britain's deepest wartime financial strain, is difficult to view as pure coincidence. The most accurate account recognizes that the Balfour Declaration emerged from a genuine convergence of pressures: financial strain, strategic necessity, sincere ideological sympathy among some officials, the personal influence and scientific contribution of Weizmann, the broader significance of the Rothschild name, the desire to secure American support, concern over Russia's potential collapse, and Britain's determination to protect the approaches to the Suez Canal. With no single factor explaining the outcome entirely, though omitting the financial dimension leaves the story noticeably incomplete. The broader lesson here extends well beyond this single episode. When governments face severe financial pressure during moments of crisis, they are often willing to make sweeping and sometimes contradictory promises in pursuit of survival. And history shows repeatedly that the people most affected by such decisions are rarely the officials or financiers involved in making them, but ordinary populations who happen to live on the land being discussed. The consequences of those 67 words have continued to shape the region for more than a century, influencing subsequent conflicts, peace negotiations, and political developments that trace their roots back to that carefully worded document issued by a financially strained government during one of the most difficult periods in its history. And understanding this fuller picture, one that includes the economic pressures of the time alongside the strategic and personal factors involved, offers a far more complete view of how this pivotal moment in 20th century history came to unfold, shaping events whose effects remain deeply relevant to international affairs today.